everyone. Welcome to today's Mobility Forum. My name is Jinhua Jiao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. I'm delighted today to have Professor Scott Moura join us today from UC Berkeley. The US power grid is already under significant stress, but imagine adding millions of electric vehicles to charge. And as many of us would like to charge rapidly, and even ideally as fast as pumping gasolines. So will this really blow up the grid? Or alternatively, if EV charging is managed strategically, and if vehicle-to-grid technology become viable, would a vast fleet of electric vehicle actually help support the grid? Could they help balance the load, regulate frequency, or enable integration of the renewable energy? Professor Scott Moura will explore this critical question in today's talk. Will EV break the power grid? Before I formally introduce Professor Scott, I do want to reinforce the norm of this forum, which is everyone, specifically referring to the audience, to contribute one idea. Everyone to contribute one idea. You can write them directly in the chat, either in the form of a comments or a question to Professor Moura. Also, as a warm-up, I do want to ask people to answer a question in the chat with a few keywords. What is the biggest challenge to integrate EV into the grid from your point of view? What is the biggest challenge you see as to integrate EV into the grid? I invite everyone to type your thought into the chat so we can see collectively what do we think in this regard. Professor Scott Moura is a Claire Singh Wenshan Distinguished Professor at UC Berkeley. He's a faculty in the Civil and Environmental Engineer, Director of the Energy Control and Application Lab, ECAL. He also directs the California Partners for Advanced Transportation Technology, PASS. He chairs the engineering science at the UC Berkeley. His research interests include control, optimization, and AI applied to battery modeling and algorithm, electrified vehicles, and power and transportation infrastructure. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Professor Moura. Scott, thanks.
Jinhua, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I'm super excited to talk about this question because it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. And my goal today is to trigger everybody's curiosity. Most of this community is, I think, in the mobility ecosystem. And my goal is to get you excited and curious about the intersection of mobility and energy and power systems, because the challenges are frankly nuts and the opportunities are tremendous. So I want to start off with this video, which is featuring recently announced technology by BYD in China, where an electric vehicle is capable of charging at 1,000 kilowatts. So what you see here is they're plugging in, they're initiating the charge, and it's synchronizing with the charging infrastructure. And what you'll see is that after a few moments, it'll ramp up to 1,000 kilowatts. And this is absolutely bananas. You know, and this technology is not just the vehicle. It has to do with the charging infrastructure. It has to do with how they design the battery pack and even the cooling system, even at the cell level to make the electrodes quite thin. You know, these are generally power cells, and absolutely wild. Okay. Let's get out of there. And after that was announced, then Zeekr followed up and Huawei followed up and said, we're going to develop 1.2 megawatt and 1.5 megawatt chargers. Absolutely nuts. And just to put this in context, because some of you may not be used to thinking about watts on a daily basis. 1 kilowatt is basically the average energy consumption for a US home. 1 megawatt is something like a small town. So we're talking about when one of these vehicles charges, it's like a small town instantaneously popping up on the grid. A mid-sized city would be something like 1 gigawatt. All of the United States would be 5,000 gigawatts. So it's a tremendous amount of power. You know, and this escalation got me thinking about this, right? Is, you know, if you can charge your vehicle overnight, all right, maybe you got my attention. That's convenient. Do it at home. All right, that sounds great. I can charge in 30 minutes. Super exciting. Charging as quickly as filling gas. Oh my goodness. And it seems like the escalation happening in China is, to get it to be faster than a sneeze. Where is this going? Can our grid withstand that? So,
Scott, by the way, the slide is not shared.
oh,
Sorry. When you stopped the video, somehow it lost the share.
oh, so you all missed the meme. No problem.
Right
All right,
now,
do you see now?
yeah, very good. Thanks.
All right, you guys get the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, let's pause for a sec. This is the obligatory part where I give a little self-promotion. So my lab is the Energy Controls and Applications Lab, focused in the fundamental areas of control systems optimization, data science, and a telescoping set of applications from batteries, models, and algorithms for batteries, up to vehicles that are automated, connected, electrified, and also the integration of transportation and power systems. I like to emphasize our product is people. Here's the lab currently. I want to highlight Iju, who's currently visiting um, with Jinhua MIT at this moment. So enabling a great collaboration there. Here are our alumni. This is really the key product in my mind. You'll see me feature some of them as we go forward. I'm also faculty director of PATH. Our mission statement is here. And what I want to highlight quickly about PATH is some of the, huge innovations that have occurred that you might use on a daily basis. So for example, in the 90s, PATH is the first to deploy automated vehicles on public roads in the 1990s. This is 1997. Maybe some people on this call weren't even born then. Just north of San Diego. And you can see here you have a safety driver who's just monitoring the system. There isn't even a smartphone to check social media while the car drives itself. They're reading a newspaper. Another one I want to highlight is actually, I think last week's speaker was Alex Byen. He basically invented traffic monitoring on Google Maps and Apple Maps, him and all his students. And at the time was developed with Nokia and other collaborators. After they did this big demonstration at UC Berkeley and PATH, Apple basically hired up much of that team. And then the Apple traffic basically became software 2.0 of what they did there, and it diffused over to Google and other places too. So this is what happens, in PATH with the university research. And PATH focuses on taking basic research and trying to cross this valley of death to partner with government entities, industry, startups to take these technologies, demonstrate them, and grow them towards deployment. There's another thing I want to mention that is related to this talk, and that is climate trace and watt time that I'm on the board of this nonprofit, which comes from another graduate of our program that I've been mentoring. So to tell the story of watt time, I need to start with Al Gore, our former vice president. So in the Paris Climate Accords, of which Al Gore was a key architect, something that vexed him for a very long time in the years afterwards were the fact that when all these countries and entities make commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, there's no way to hold them accountable. We don't have a really great way to measure greenhouse gas emissions around the world until now. And that's where a startup that emerged out of the lab, Watt Time, then created this program, Climate Trace. And let me just show you how it works. So basically, the idea is to take satellite imagery from over 100 satellites, combine it with AI, where now we have a greenhouse gas inventory for all of planet Earth. So you can go to climatetrace.org, click on Explore Map, and now you can explore greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the whole world. Here I'm focusing on California, where I live. You can see there's about 500 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, zooming into the East Bay, and you can see point sources here, a oil refinery. You can also see transportation is a big source. This is international shipping, right? May change with tariffs. Oakland Airport. And then I'm going to zoom in here into the rural communities so you can see things like
we're not
landfills.
seeing the slides. We're
Say
not
again?
seeing the slides.
We can. It's good.
I can see slides.
Yeah, we can see it. Scott, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, now you stop the sharing though. Yeah, if you can redo it now.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks.
Do you see now?
No, we see a big arrow somehow.
Zoom is still hard after all this time.
Now we can see the website. Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
All right. I think you get the idea here. So I encourage you all to explore it. You can feel free to go to climatetrace.org, click Explore Map, and you can see for yourself. Okay. The other reason I'm so passionate about this of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is because of the wildfires in Los Angeles. So in this video, what I'm showing you is a video of my parents' house. So it was that one that was on fire there. And, that's a still shot of it when, although they were told to evacuate, some neighbors came by and took this photo, shared it with them. This is what it looked like afterwards. And they sent me a photo just last week after they cleared off everything. And, because of more extreme climate events, it's basically like someone hit the delete button on the house, right? No more house. They're fine and healthy and doing well, in fact. Another recent event is the outages in the Iberian Peninsula. So this is Spain and Portugal. Different sort of issue, and it's still under investigation exactly what happened there. Something I want to highlight that could be related, I'm not saying this is the issue, is that as we move away from these thermal generators, which have literally large machines with a lot of rotating inertia that's maintaining frequency, and we're replacing them with solar, where there's these inverters. There literally isn't rotating inertia. It makes it easier to destabilize the frequency. And that's really illustrated in this really nice example where there's an event in Florida, and you can see the frequency of the grid changing as it propagates all throughout the eastern US. So this seems to be what's related to that outage. And as we increase the number of solar, PV, batteries, and so forth, this is an issue we have to contend with. So let me now kind of motivate further. Worldwide, there's 51 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And worldwide, you can see transportation is 16% of that. But in more developed economies, let me focus on California, it's the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, about 40%. Right. So decarbonizing transportation, and EVs is a leading technology for that, is critically important to reducing the probability of, your parents losing their house, for example. Now, one of the key issues is the integration of renewables. So let me take a moment to explain the duck curve if you're not familiar. Now, this is a cartoon that was basically created in 2012 when the state of California was debating, should we have a policy of 33% renewables by the year 2020. And what you see here is, here was the load curve in 2012. And as they added more renewables, particularly solar being subtracted off, the remainder is what all the remaining non-renewable generators need to follow to balance supply and demand. And the key issue is ramping, right? Is how do we get traditional generators to ramp up and down quickly? Coal and nuclear cannot ramp up and down quickly. Turns out natural gas saved us because it can. Now, that was in 2020, projecting, that was 2012, projecting to 2020. What's happening in California right now, if you're not aware, is absolutely nuts. So this is April. Already in April, the net demand is in fact negative. So we're producing more clean electricity, more electricity than we can even consume. And the ramping is even more than was projected before. In 3 hours, a ramp of 20,000 megawatts. More than that, we're generating so much solar here, we're having to curtail it, that is, cut it off. And you can see here in purple, I know this is small, but we're also maximizing the amount of electricity we can export out of California and building a lot of batteries. Now, then you add EVs to the mix, right? So now everybody's going to come home at the end of the day, they're going to try to charge, and it's only going to exacerbate. And actually, in the evening is when you have the most greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to move quickly through these ideas. At least in California, what I want people to do is to leave their house with 30% charge. And then charge during the day, like at work, so we can align it with this valley period. Good for many reasons, and we need flexibility. So let me say a little bit more about, increasing demand for electricity and planned supply. So in the United States, the supply of electricity, or the demand of electricity, hasn't grown that much over the past couple decades. But that's projected to change for a variety of reasons: data centers, onshoring and industrial electrification. Transportation electrification is projected to contribute maybe 10% of this load growth, maybe more. And California plans to add basically double the amount of electricity generation that they currently have. The next point I want to make here is how much electricity generators are in the queue to connect to the grid. And the story here is absolutely bananas, because you can see here over the years in all these regions like California, the Midwest, PJM territory, there's an increasing number of generators that are in the queue, and 95% of them are solar, wind, and storage, a tremendous amount of clean energy technologies. But the thing that's absolutely bananas is only 20% of these projects and only 14% of the capacity requesting to interconnect, within this 18-year period, has reached commercial operations by the end of 2023 for a whole variety of reasons, which maybe we'll get into. You can ask me questions about. So there's this huge backlog, and it's not getting over the hump. Now, if we look at all the opportunities for demand flexibility, let me highlight this concept of virtual power plants. Many categories of demand are flexible, like EVs, and many categories are controllable. There's this word, this term, this jargon, virtual power plant, which really refers to some portfolio of distributed energy resources. Think your EV, your water heater. And if you can somehow aggregate them together, then they can become like a type of battery, a virtual battery. And here, this analysis by the Brattle Group shows that, you can avoid a lot of the costs and reap a lot of the benefits without having to worry about interconnection, just leveraging what's already on the edge of the grid with these virtual power plants. And so there's these studies that look at, this one from Stanford, Siobhan Powell, and Ram Rajagopal, where they show that, if we can align charging with the middle of the day, we can reduce peak load. There's this excellent study by Alan Jen at UC Davis, where they look not at peak load in the entire grid, but at the distribution feeder. This is like more at the edge of the grid in your neighborhoods. And this is where there's really going to be more stress. And what they find here is the more red it becomes, the more overloaded these distribution feeders become. And in fact, by the year 2045, they're projecting here that 2/3 of the feeders are going to become overloaded. And here they break it up by the different regions in California. Okay. So I've been talking for a bit. Scott, will EVs break the grid? Yes, but maybe not. Okay, so the key is flexibility. And so I'm going to highlight this project that we've been working on called SlrpEV super briefly. The idea is to optimize price and learn user preferences. And here we made an app where people could choose 2 services for how they charge: regular, that charges immediately at full power until they unplug or top off, or scheduled, where they tell us when they depart how much extra range they need, and then we can optimize it and enable flexibility. Eju here created this amazing dashboard with a master's student. You could check it out. All the data is open. if you want to use this data. And here, really, the idea is incorporating human behavior with Sanjay and Tang, who now work at Honda and formerly at Tesla, Tang. We can now sort of enable human behavior. So here we're putting some stress on humans to make a choice, but it turns out they engage. And you can use discrete choice models, and now we've moved to AI models to be able to model this human behavior. So let me just show you the results here. Is we've shown that you can actually increase net revenue by lowering the costs to both users and the operating costs by shifting to times with lower electricity rates. And so you can see that visualized here, where basically the reddish period that you can see in the late evening, you just want to move charging out of that period. And so, and to the extent possible, move it into the off-peak period, this beigeish color. And it turns out that if you can move charging, pass on the savings to EV drivers, we found that they will engage. We've also shown that you can reduce peak power. This is work by Sam Bobick, who's going to do his PhD at Stanford, and Thibault, who's coming over to Berkeley, where you can reduce the peak and also shift out of this period. Here's some numerical results showing that. And there's other ideas. I want to highlight quickly just EJU has looked at robochargers, where you have these robotic charging units that'll move between vehicles, and you can decouple the charging infrastructure from the vehicle. Super cool idea. This is, not our work, but, an image of what this could look like. E has also looked at, if you understand the trajectory of EV drivers along their routes and their accessibility to charging, maybe you can nudge them to pick different places and times for when they charge. So here we've looked at the accessibility along their trajectory. And the last idea I'll show you is battery swapping for heavy and medium duty trucks. Here, you can decouple the charging of the battery from the mobility of the vehicle, where batteries can charge, asynchronously from the vehicles being off the road. They can charge at a much slower rate. They basically serve as an energy storage system on the grid. Meanwhile, they're providing this added service of mobility, e-mobility, in terms of battery charging as a service. So I know I'm going quick through this, and we can, flip back to anything during Q&A. Will EVs break the power grid? Well, first, why are we even talking about this? The reason we're talking about this is it's about greenhouse gas emissions, localized emissions, and extreme events, things like wildfires. But it is true that the trajectory towards 100% ZVs will require significant power grid infrastructure upgrades. There's a huge queue of clean energy, but the interconnection is slow. And we can talk about why that is. So there's a massive need and opportunity to create demand flexibility from EV charging. I've shown a few ideas we've been thinking about, but let's talk more in Q&A. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. So I'll start with a few questions there. One is, in transportation, we often complain the degree of irrationality so everywhere in transportation system. It seems that the energy systems is no better than that. You just give a few examples that's as irrational as we see here. So one note to start with is, if you compare the vehicle and transportation as a system and versus the grid as a system or technology, is it fair to say the innovation speed is much, much faster in the vehicle side than the grid side, right? So we hear a lot of innovation in transportation, in vehicle, but in grid, what are the innovation happening in the last 20 years, if any?
Great question, Jinhua. So I understood it is, what's the rate of innovation look like on the grid side versus the automotive side?
Yeah.
So my perception is that on net, the rate of innovation on the vehicle side is much faster than the grid side for the simple reason of regulation. So for example, if you want to interconnect any sort of energy generation or storage asset to the grid, then you have to go through an interconnection study, right? Where they look at what is the effects on the network by interconnecting this resource, because everybody's connected to the same resource. The analogy on the mobility side would be like each time you buy a car, we have to do a travel demand study to figure out, what is the impact going to be on our transportation network. So
Right.
Obviously that doesn't happen. I don't know, maybe it should. We can You can play with that idea.
That was strangle the whole industry, I guess. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think regulation is a big part of it, but I also don't want to downplay the amount of innovation that's happening in the electric grid. There's a tremendous amount of innovation, and something I'm really trying to highlight here is there's a lot of flexibility that we can get in our electricity system by not necessarily adding more resources to the grid, but leveraging the flexibility that we have in our demand that's already connected by really adding the cyber layer, making it interconnected and coordinating it, which can really enable decarbonization of transportation. So it's kind of a choice. Do we want to invest in upgrading a huge amount of our power grid so we can get this BYD mega chargers, or can we take kind of a more let me call it a more technology forward approach where we can create these virtual power plants to enable flexibility so now transportation becomes a grid asset.
Right. Yeah. So on that point, you mentioned to solve this duck curve issue, ideally, you want people in the morning leave house at 30% charge and charge the car at work or public charging, etc. Right. So if you think about the current pricing level, it's exactly the opposite, right? It's much cheaper to charge at home than public Wi-Fi, right? So to really shift that, what needs to happen to enable that massive behavior shift there?
Yeah, Jinhua, great question. It's 100% true that it's cheaper to charge at home in a lot of regions. So what is the economic incentive for someone to charge in the middle of the day? So this is what we need policymakers to look at. Because from the grid perspective, in California, so what I described as a kind of a California specific thing, where we should make public workday charging cheaper than at home and more convenient than at home. It's sometimes not that today. And part of the reason is because the charging infrastructure, the capital cost to install the charging infrastructure is still quite high. Not just the equipment, but also the planning, acquiring the real estate, going through permitting, this interconnection process. I built this charging station at Berkeley, and God, I've got scars and stories that I can tell you about the pain of just trying to put in 8 charging points on a university campus. Yeah. So because of that difficulty, they need to get a return on that investment, and the prices are higher. So that's a tremendous challenge. And with SlrpEV, what we're trying to do is to break that problem by saying, okay, a lot of chargers just work like a normal wall outlet, right? Just 1,000 kilowatts immediately. But people largely don't need that, right? If you're there shopping for a couple hours, and you want to top off 25, 50 miles, then you can charge more slowly. You can pass off that savings to consumers. And now you enable what you just asked about, Jinhua. So we can do that on the private side without having policymakers change too much. But we also need policymakers who are setting these tariff rates to align the tariffs with what's good for the grid. Sorry, last point I'll make about this is that the cost of electricity is generally lower in the middle of the day in California in the wholesale market. So when you aggregate EV charging, now you become like a generator, and you're not paying the tariffs that normal ratepayers pay. You're paying and participating in the electricity market, and then you could take advantage of that price. So I've given like 3 avenues to get around the question that you asked.
Oh, good. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So given this price differential, that leads to the possibility of the vehicle to grid charge on this, right? So we've been talking about the vehicle to grid charge for a while. How meaningful do you see this possibility? And if we were to make it a reality, is it still a technology issue, a behavior issue, or incentive issue, or is still a policy issue here?
Yeah, question was about vehicle to grid. and its potential. So when I was a first year PhD student at the University of Michigan, one of the first papers I read was about vehicle to grid and the economic opportunity by an absolute legend, Willett Kempton at the University of Delaware, who I see as like, the godfather of this technology and super great person. And I love nerding out with him today about this technology. All that said, I'm skeptical about vehicle to grid. What I found myself in our own studies is a lot of the benefits of vehicle to grid you can get with unidirectional charging. Once you add the export of electricity from vehicles, it becomes a lot more complicated. Um, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's basically like a mini generator that connects and disconnects from the grid randomly, potentially at different locations. And that's very difficult for grid operators and utilities to deal with because now they don't have visibility on exactly all the resources and how much power that they could be injecting back into the grid. So it becomes very cumbersome. Now, we are working on a project, potentially. We put in a proposal for something partnered with It's Electric, a super interesting Brooklyn-based company, and University of Delaware, Willett Kempton, where I think where we're working on communication technologies to enable this coordination. But my short response would be to look at how much of the benefits can you gain with unidirectional charging, and then is the pain to make the export of electricity from the vehicle worth that kind of last bit of benefit?
I see. Thank you. Yeah. So next one is moving from the electric vehicle to the autonomous vehicle. But in the autonomy, I particularly mentioned the potential to have a direct control of the vehicle charging behavior as part of the autonomy there, right? How would that help change the system here?
Yeah. So I think in the mobility sector, we're sort of fleetizing our whole mobility system, right? With automated vehicle fleets, but think about moving goods, of course, with these trucking fleets, vans, mobility as a service. This actually creates much more of an opportunity because now if we are converting more vehicles on the road to fleet operators are of course strategic in their operations and they're super cost sensitive, right? They're not as excited about the convertible Mustang wind in your hair and you know they are making decisions about their operations all about costs. So they can do the same with charging, right? And to the extent that they can still provide the mobility service. They can be strategic about when they charge. They could potentially have some on-site storage at the depots where they charge to kind of offset the time, mitigate the peak demand. So yeah, fleets are a huge opportunity to create flexibility to enable electrification. They are uniquely positioned to handle this.
I see. Oh, talking about fleet, one type of fleet is the public buses. That right? Yeah. So for that, U.S. is way behind in many European or China. So where do you see the public transit side electrification could go here?
Yeah, so I'm smiling because I was just trading messages with Madeline Zhu, who was in a US DOT and working on smart grants, and we were talking about this Dave Roberts podcast where they're talking about electric buses. So I think I'm obligated to say in this moment that if the goal is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, do you want to convert a bus to electric? That could be a lot more expensive. Or do you just want to get more people into a nice bus and get them out of personal vehicles, right? So the goal, I think, is reducing greenhouse gas emissions per mile per person. So we can work in that denominator to just get more people in buses, right? So I'm a big car guy. I love car culture. I really do. But the reality is to solve the problems we need to solve, it's about that metric, right? So I think it's difficult for transit operators to say you've got to, incur this cost, convert to electric. Okay, all of that said, I think a lot of good can come from not electric buses, just more people in buses. Um, Bus operators also it's the same answer as fleet operators. The challenge, Jinhua, though, that I didn't say before is bus operators know how to operate bus fleets. They don't know how to manage energy assets. And so this is creating an additional burden on them. I once consulted for the West Bengal government who converted their bus fleet to electric, and they didn't know how to charge and how to deal with how range would be cut in half because they weren't trained or didn't have the tools to understand these issues with charging buses. And they basically left the electric buses in the depot and went back to the diesel buses. So that's a bad outcome. We need tools to help fleet operators, including bus operators, to manage their electric bus fleet. We can't just incentivize the purchase of the vehicle. We need proper tools.
Right. Many of the fleet management, either public transit or fleet or freight, they often feel trouble when we deal with the grid. It seems that the grid are not that excited about, oh, I'll build a substation for you so that you can charge your 300 buses, etc. So what's the incentive structure from a grid company? Why they are so hesitant?
Yeah. Okay. Super good question. So, and I'm super glad to share with this audience what's happening on the grid side. So it turns out that in investor-owned utilities, so these are utilities that have a regulated monopoly in particular territories. So California is like this, and in I think in Massachusetts it's the same. Is they actually get the way that they give a return to their investors is they have a regulated rate of return on the infrastructure that they build. So what that means is that if they have to build added infrastructure, there's a capital cost for that, right? But then they will be able to change the rates to the customers so that they get a guaranteed return on that over time. Yeah.
Right.
But then the regulator, usually these public utility commissions, have to approve it. So there's a tension between, okay, if we increase demand, we got to build these assets, but then it could increase the cost for customers. And the public utility commissions are basically trying to make this trade-off. You can't have both, right? Of how do we keep the costs down? But if we do build this infrastructure, then the utility gets a rate of return. So actually, the utility is kind of incentivized to build. It's the opposite of what you said. They're kind of incentivized to build, this infrastructure, but then they have to get approval from the Public Utilities Commission, which for the people wants to keep the costs low. So they want to be strategic about it. And the way, like in data centers, is the next natural question.
Right.
How are these being built out? Is basically the Metas, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world, these hyperscalers, they're coming with their own capital. They're saying, we will pay for the infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah. See. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So let me get back to the initial story. You talk about the megawatt charger in China there, right? Maybe two questions. One is how did China make it happen? I mean, how does their grid really handle this, right? The second thing is you mentioned, is it really need megawatt charger there, right? I mean, do we really need that hurry? But the thing is, whenever the technology exists, people desire that. It's very hard to stop that desire this, right? Yeah. It's just like in the e-commerce. Previously, we say we order something 1 week, it comes. Now it's 2 days. Now it's the same day. Now it's 2 hours delivery. The desire is almost infinite on this, right? So if that's this, from the US grid point of view, that seems like impossibility to handle this level of megawatt charger there.
Yeah, how they make it happen in China, so now I'm gonna conjecture because I haven't been there to see that particular technology myself, but I imagine that they have some energy storage that's buffering, with the grid interconnection, and obviously there's only there will be particular places where you can access this megawatt charging. Although I think they announced something like 1,000 charging points across the country in China.
Right.
Okay, but there two more points. One is that I think the goal here isn't to say that people will use megawatt charging. I think it's to help the purchasing population get over the mental hurdle of, hey, I'm used to charging in just a couple minutes. I want to know that that same experience is possible, right? There's this super interesting study out of Australia where they tracked Tesla users for many years, and they found that Tesla users, as time, they got used to how they charge their vehicle, and they don't charge it to as high state of charge or use fast charging as much as they get more used to the idea that I can charge overnight or at home or with a level 1 type of wall outlet. So I think it's almost symbolic, right? That capability. And that I think is useful and powerful. Second point I'll make is, in the United States, I think Lucid is at the top in developing technology in this space. And when they announced the gravity vehicle, super interesting to check out the videos on the engineering behind it. I was trading messages with some people that work there, and they thought, they could do something like that. But the reality is, for the vast majority of consumers, it's not useful. So given the cost trade-offs. So you want, convenient high power, but you also want flexibility, and you want to be able to charge anywhere and everywhere, not just have these selected points where it might work. So there's obviously a trade-off here.
I see. Here's the last question from me. Then we'll give it to John for the audience question. When we talk about the storage, right? That's one way to solve this demand supply kind of misalignment. So in the gas station, right? One pump, the equivalent kilowatt hour is about 10 megawatts of power. Is the pump? You have to appreciate how good. Yes. Gasoline is as a storage of energy there, right? You have to say that. But then we don't have the equivalent of a tank underneath the gasoline for battery, for electricity yet. So in terms of the battery technology, how far away from this grade level storage that can put this gas tank level equivalent of a battery underneath those charging stations?
Yeah, question was how close are we to getting the energy density of hydrocarbon liquid fuels, the equivalent of that? And you weren't talking about on the vehicle, actually. You were talking about, on the to buffer a charging station or something like that.
Yeah.
So in battery innovation, they, my friend and colleague at now he's at Michigan, Venkat Vishwanathan, he talks about the and problem. So you're specifically asking about gravimetric, well, energy density, both gravimetric and volumetric. But for grid scale storage, including to buffer charging stations, that's not the only thing you want. You obviously want to optimize for cost as well. You want to trade it off also with longevity and safety. So we call this the and problem in the battery community, right? So I can name some technologies, but I'd say for stationary storage, the trade-off between that and problem is such that you can have higher weight, you can have higher volume, when it's stationary offboard a mobile application, because then it's more important about cycle life, safety, and perhaps cost. But in things like UAVs, where, besides moving from point A to point B, you decide you want to fight gravity at the same time, you need to really reduce that gravimetric energy costs. There are very exciting developments happening. And so in the media, they call it solid state batteries, but really the technology is lithium metal batteries. Lithium metal on the anode side, and the solid state is to protect from it. It's about improving the safety of those systems, can potentially double the energy density of lithium ion batteries. But I think the trade-off is such that maybe that doesn't make sense for stationary energy storage.
I see. Yeah.
UAVs, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. So John, for the audience question. John, please.
Super. Okay, Scott, so many comments in the chat, and we're going to share the file with you because a lot of very, very interesting reactions and reflections to your talk. Just to start out with a question sort of about problem definition coming from, and my apologies for mispronouncing a multisyllabic last name, from Chandrima Mukhopadhyay. So the question is, what percentage of new energy demand is for electric vehicles? Now, I think you mentioned in your talk that we're expecting transport to account for roughly 10% of the growth. Just by extension on that question, how does this relate to the rise of data centers, heat pumps, all the other demands for electricity? We are a mobility and transportation crowd on this forum. Take us out of that for a moment and put us in the minds of the utility crowd. And how are they talking about all of these, new sources of demand for electricity, and how do EVs kind of fit into that big picture?
Yeah, super good question. Thanks, John. Yes, so as I said super quickly through the talk, the electricity demand in the United States has remained relatively flat for the past decades. And although there's been economic growth, that's been offset by energy efficiency gains, which is very good. But there are, 4 or 5 things that are going to dramatically increase demand. The biggest thing, honestly, is industrial electrification, right? So this is electrifying, things like, well, there's actually things like electrolyzing water to create hydrogen. It's also things like carbon dioxide removal. It's also modernizing a lot of manufacturing facilities to use more electric loads. And that's going to contribute something like 40%, something around that area. Transportation, about 10%. You asked about heat pumps. Building electrification is like another 10%. Data centers might be something like on the order of, 20%. So all of these factors are coming together, and electric utilities are saying and the US Department of Energy is also saying we need to increase dramatically the amount of electricity generation that we have. A very concerning thing that I, highlighted super quick is that there's a lot of developers that want to deliver this electricity generation, but the interconnection queue is getting more jammed up. So only 20% of the generation that has been in the queue to connect to provide that supply actually came to fruition, which is a huge problem. A lot of it has to do with regulation, some NIMBYism. A lot of it has to do with, because there's this long queue, you've got developers that may not have all the financing all set up. They just go in the queue and they jam it up, even though there's a low probability that they get the financing for it. So this is really concerning utilities and grid operators of we need, and the US Department of Energy. So, when Chris Wright talks about abundance and things like that, I think part of what he's talking about is this problem in unleashing American energy. So there's an element of this that's totally true, of course, that we need to create more electricity generation and not allow all this generation to get jammed up in the queue. This study by Lawrence Berkeley Lab is super interesting. I encourage people to check it out.
Super. Okay, thanks. A bunch of questions around pricing incentives. So I'm going to read 3 questions very quickly and go about answering it how you wish. Henry Kelly asked, will utility regulators be willing or able to design rates that will encourage optimal charging patterns? So can the regulators sort of get into the pricing game? It's the first question. Joachim Ostas asks, why have power companies such as PG&E not changed their time of use rate schedules to encourage charging during the day? So what's going on with utilities? Are they reacting to these price signals, or being more assertive in price signals? And then Kate Roberts asked, won't that, and she was referring to, you had mentioned that your suggestion of encouraging charging at work when solar is very plentiful. And Kate asks, won't that cost people more to charge at work and increase the total cost of ownership? To which I think you alluded to, well, actually not in California. So let me give you a chance to respond to those three, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, super excellent questions. These are the questions to ask. Let me start with that. Similarly, public utilities commissions, who ultimately approve rates that utilities might propose, they also need to consider trade-offs. So the problem, so again, using California as an example, the most expensive period is in the late afternoon, evening, because of that duck curve ramping problem, right? Is because there's relatively fewer assets that can ramp up super quickly. So they're trying to disincentivize peak power. So actually, to refine my point a little bit, you would like to shift it to before that late afternoon, evening period. The second thing that is happening is actually at the national level, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they created a regulation. It's got a nice number 2222. And what that regulation says is it allows an aggregator who can aggregate things like EV charging to participate in electricity markets. And then if you have an aggregator that can participate in electricity markets, they can ultimately pay consumers to shift their time of use. So the answer to the question is there's mechanisms where whatever the utilities are doing and whatever they agreement that they might have with the Public Utilities Commission, there are other opportunities where private players can create these virtual power plants, these aggregators, and they can offset whatever costs you're paying to your utility to where in the wholesale market where the aggregator plays, they can take advantage of these low costs. So, while it might take some time to shift the utility rates, there's other ways to enable this.
Okay, just to build on that for one moment, give us a primer here. So you had said where you are in Berkeley, California, because of all the solar coming on midday, electricity costs less in the daytime than it does in the nighttime, right? But if you live in Rochester, New York, it might be exactly the opposite, correct?
Right.
So how do you think about that? And what can you tell us? Like, what do we need to understand about the geography here in the United States and then on a global level about sort of this time of day pricing of electricity?
Yeah. And I'm smiling because my mother's from Rochester, New York, and she would agree that there's no sunshine in the middle of the day in that city. So as we add more clean and often variable renewable energy, we need other assets that can be flexible to help match supply and demand. That's ultimately what the duck curve story is, because we're getting this, higher variance curve that we need to zero out. And that will look different in different regions. Regions that have a high amount of wind, could have a much more variable profile with, different periodicity. So in different parts of the world, as we increase the amount of variable renewable energy, what we need, Jesse Jenkins often calls it, firm energy, right? That is energy that we can ramp up and down. And EVs provide a huge opportunity for this to be able to balance supply and demand.
Super. Okay, Scott, there are a bunch of questions about sort of batteries as storage buffers. And I know with Jinhua, we talked about V to G. So Eric Sabina asked a question, basically, should we all get large home batteries and charge them in the middle of the day, then use those batteries to charge our EVs at home in the evening?
You know, one thing that's interesting is that if your utility pays you the same to export power from your home as importing, right? So there's a net metering agreement, then you don't need a home battery because the grid is your battery. Why would you pay for it? The reason, I think actually the primary motivator often for home batteries is for resilience and for outages, right? That's a huge benefit. What is the cost and the value of being able to have power when there's an outage? In a situation where your utility will credit you much less than what you pay to import electricity, then a home battery for an everyday usage might start to make a case for itself. California switched from a net metering agreement where now you get credited a lot less, and it basically kind of put a big damper on the solar market inside California, and that was a concern for the industry. But they did it for equity reasons having to do with not putting too much burden on people who can't afford batteries and solar, who would then be burdened with paying more of the costs to maintain the grid. So interesting scenario there.
And by the way, what you just pointed out, a little bit like the Rochester and Berkeley example, that's another thing that varies tremendously by geography, right? I mean, I live in Belmont, Massachusetts, and if I produce solar electricity with the panels on my roof, I'm paid 11 cents per kilowatt hour for the electricity I produce. But to buy that electricity from my utility is more like 22, 25 cents per kilowatt hour. And so you have variation in that dynamic as well, all across the country, all around the world, which makes it a complicated challenge, I think, for those of us, who are purchasing an EV to think about, what's the best way to manage all of this. Good. Jinhua, you're on mute.
No, John, so do you want to try one more minute? One more question?
Yeah, you bet, you bet. So just sticking to that topic of batteries as storage buffers, we had a question from Stephen Schmidt. If just a small fraction of batteries allocated for producing EVs over the next 30 years were instead allocated for grid battery storage, whose purpose was to shift solar from midday to evening, wouldn't that be an enormous win?
When I was preparing this talk and I put the curves for California's supply that I flashed real quickly, something that shocked me since I did this a couple years ago is how much battery, the amount of battery capacity on California's grid has increased in the past years. It is bananas. And so that's already happening, in fact. And of course, there's policies in the state of California that are incentivizing this. I think the market dynamics all around the world are enabling this idea. So, but there's more competition. There's a lot more competition. I think Tesla has been making a good business out of this in North America, but there's a lot more competitors worldwide that are starting to participate.
Good. We're at time now. Professor Scott Moura, thank you so much for bringing this integrated thinking between the energy system and the transportation system, right? During the ICE time, the energy system transportation always intertwined, but at the electric era, I think the two are much more integrated together on this. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, please join me. Thank you, Professor Moura, for the presentation. And